welcome to Virtual Book Signing. I'm Daniel Weinberg, and as usual, we're at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. What you're looking at right now is a pin that we have in our stock that might be one that John Wilkes Booth once owned. This beautiful necktie pin, cravat pin, was made of coral and gold, and the family that I got this from said that Booth gave it to their family. So I kind of believe that it is, but who's to know? But Booth is going to be spoken about today, so I thought I'd wear it in, I guess, his honor. So we have two wonderful books here today, and two wonderful authors who wrote them. Anthony Pitch is a former journalist in England, Africa, and Israel. He's been a broadcast editor for the Associated Press and a senior writer for U.S. News and World Report's book division. He's the author of The Burning of Washington, The British Invasion of 1814. And he co-authored Chained Eagle, the true heroic story of 8½ years as a POW. Today's book is They Have Killed Papa Dead, The Road to Ford's Theater, Abraham Lincoln's Murder, and the Rage for Vengeance. Steerforth Press produced this, and is 493 pages and illustrated, and is $29.95. Also with us today is Michael Weeks, an amateur historian, he calls himself, but in the best sense of the phrase, with a passion for the road. He's traveled tens of thousands of miles in search of the living roots of U.S. history. In reality, he's an industrial hygiene consultant. But he's also the author of the Complete Civil War Road Trip Guide, which had been a history book club selection. He's a member of the Chicago Writers Association and a trustee of the Civil War Roundtable here in Chicago. He's on the board of the Camp Douglas Restoration Foundation as well. His latest book is this wonderful cover, as Anthony mentioned before we started, Civil War Road Trip, Volume 1, a guide to Northern Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, 1861 to 1863, First Manassas to Gettysburg. The Countryman Press publishes this. It's 1995, 511 pages, profusely illustrated with maps and photos, synopsis of battles, biographical sketches of the players, and in each chapter, our own shop's Tom Trescott gives his recommendations for further reading. So I'm going to ask each of you to first give us some idea of why you came to this book and why at this moment. Anthony, I'm sure this is something that comes up because there are so many books on the assassination. It's a wonderful book you wrote, but why?
A lot of people ask me the same question. They said, what new can you tell us? I actually applied for a grant from an institution that will be nameless, and I was rejected. I asked them for the reasons. They sent me the reasons. They redacted the names of the judges. One of them had written, I suppose he'll tell us there was a conspiracy. It was savage ridicule. Now I knew, living 20 miles north of the Library of Congress and the National Archives in Washington, D.C., that if I was prepared to do what I've done with my other books, give it my full attention, my dedication, and persistence, and of course a measure of luck, I would inevitably come up with new information. And I did. So much new information, whether it was really substantial or just colorful to add texture to the story. I targeted the diaries, the journals, the letters of the contemporaneous people, spectators or participants, or people within the loop. And I went 9 years in this project of research, 9 years. And I found stuff that was pay dirt very early into my research. The biggest thing that I found was Lincoln at the second inaugural was in the US Capitol. He'd just come from the old Senate chamber, having witnessed the inauguration of Andrew Johnson. He got to the rotunda and a man burst from the crowd. And Benjamin Brown French, whose papers I'd targeted, he was Commissioner of Public Buildings, he in charge of the expenditures at the White House, a Grand Mason, in which capacity he had officiated at the laying of the cornerstone of the Washington Monument in 1848. He was within the loop, and he grabbed this man. The man had blazing eyes and jet black hair, and he insisted on his right to be there. And French thought, maybe he's a new congressman, I don't know, so he released him. By that time, Lincoln had gone through to the east front of the Capitol to be inaugurated. He was totally unaware of what had happened behind him. And nobody questioned this man's motives or intentions because he hadn't broken any law. 6 weeks later, John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln. And Booth's photograph was all over the country. And French, the letter I found in the Library of Congress, in his papers, he wrote to a relative, "The face of the man is the face of the man I encountered in the rotunda at the Capitol." That was the biggest scoop that I got. Then,
Before you go on, did he feel that that was an actual attempted attack on him?
I never speculated in my book.
Did he speculate?
No, he didn't either.
Okay.
We're cut from the same cloth. If I could not document anything, it didn't make it into the book. I have 1,900 footnotes, and I wanted the reader, footnotes are footprints of the author. And you can substantiate where you went. You can corroborate what you're saying by going to the primary source. I targeted primary source material because I detest rehashing other people's stories. This is what's done so often. And I like to actually feel the original document. I get a thrill out of this. On the inaugural airing of Book TV, Brian Lamar, head of C-SPAN, interviewed me in the Jefferson Building of the Library of Congress. He said, "Would you like any props?" And I said, "Please bring down from the Rare Books Division the book stolen by the British Admiral in James Madison's office, the President's office, while they were burning the White House, while they were burning the Capitol." And they brought it down and gave me the white gloves, and I was trembling because this is the visible proof of its happenings, the tangible proof. And so if you are a researcher who appreciates not only the story, but the actual artifact, the relic of that time, you can't help but act in a tremulous manner. That's my personal sensitivity, and that's why I went for this story. None of the books I had read conveyed the sadness of this story. I rated the saddest story in American history, and so many people have written all over the country after I appeared on C-SPAN, the History Channel, and NPR. I talked about this book, and they wrote and they read it, and they've written. They wept. A lot of people wept when they finished this book. I had got to them. And when I spoke in Ford's Theatre on the anniversary of Lincoln's death, my wife counted 5 men crying their hearts out. And I said to her, "I'm glad, because if they didn't, I hadn't succeeded." And I didn't have to embellish it, because the story has its own momentum. It's the saddest story in American history. Sadder than JFK's death, because Kennedy was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He had Harvard. He had everything at his, in the palm of his hand. Lincoln came from nowhere. And I think he was one of the greatest writers in the English language. I mean, the Gettysburg Address I compared to Mozart. If you take away a note from Mozart, it collapses. If you take away a word from the Gettysburg Address, it's imperfect. That's how I rate Abraham Lincoln, and I wanted to convey in my book what had been lost to the living with his removal. It wasn't just the removal of a president. It was a removal of somebody remarkable that is born once in a blue moon.
Of course, you're talking to the choir here at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop about artifacts that, and most of the people that are on watching us today and on the archives. By the way, I did not say to all of you who are watching, while we're live here, we hope that you will get interested enough to email in a question. Give us your name and where you're from, and we'll say George from Poughkeepsie, if that's whom you are, but we'd love to hear from you while we're live. If you're on the archives, we will have signed books ready for you later on for you to buy while they last, first editions, hopefully, although Mr. Pitch's book at this point is past that, but we happened to have you in town and we had to have you here. Michael, totally different story here, but tell us about why this book, how you got to it, and how many volumes you envision. This is volume 1, and also what grabbed you about road tripping, as you say. Did you see yourself as a Civil War Jack Kerouac?
No, I wouldn't say that exactly.
Hunter Thompson?
Actually, it was very similar to Andrew's experience. It was the need to be there. It was the need to see and feel and touch this history. I'm a checklister. I'm one of those people that if there are things that I want to do or things that I want to see, I write them down. I use Excel sheets. But I got out of college and I moved out east for the first time. First time I'd been in that part of the country though. And was living in Philadelphia for a few years, a place where you can't help but soak up the history. You can't get away from it if you want to. And I'd always had an interest in the Civil War. And I'd seen the Ken Burns documentary and read a few things, but it was my first chance to really go to Gettysburg, go to Antietam, and see some of these places. And it really had an effect on me. Well, I guess there were two things. One, that it really did have an effect on me walking the ground. It made it a huge difference, not just in understanding what happened, but in understanding why I was born. And the second thing that really caught me was that everything was so close together. My first trip was to Gettysburg, and I spent a day there, and I was in a hotel that night, and I was thinking, well, I could drive back to Philly the next morning. But you know, Antietam is just an hour away, I may as well go down there. And I did. And I spent some time in Antietam and looked at the map again, and wow, Harper's Ferry is just down the road. So that's how it started, with these sort of big checklist items. Then I started getting more into the history and reading deeper into the history. I read Shelby Foote, I read James Pierce, and I started reading about all these places that I had not heard of. Perryville, Champion Hill, Island Number 10, which is so close to us here in Chicago that, you know, it just blew my mind that these places were so important, but I hadn't heard about them. So the wheels started turning in my head about, well, there's got to be something there now. So I made a bigger checklist, and I started to go to these other places, and I visited and found some really incredible things, and also found, unfortunately, a few places that are parking lots now, a few that are underwater, and that sort of thing. We've lost a few along the way, certainly. But one other thing that I found was that if I was going to see one major battlefield, I would always run across a smaller battlefield somewhere along the way. Something that was maybe a small city park or a town monument or a town museum, where in the grand scheme of the war it may not have been, it had a direct impact on the outcome of the war, but somebody in that place had decided, you know what, this is important. It's important enough for us to remember, and I'm going to do something about it. And some of these places for these small battlefields are really incredible. So the list got bigger and bigger and bigger, and before I knew it, I had written the first book, The Complete Civil War Road Trip Guide, which covers the whole continental U.S. I go as far west as New Mexico and up to Vermont. My knowledge of the war was growing as I visited these places. But what I found was, and this was certainly the case for me, as I talked to people about the first book, it's very easy to get lost in the amount of history that there is. Between the two sides, something near 800 generals between the Union and Confederate armies, and all of these different place names and people and different stories, and it can be overwhelming. So what I decided to do with this book is to take a different spin on it. Rather than saying, okay, you're in Southwest Missouri, here are all the places you should see in Southwest Missouri. I decided to make it more narrative. So that's where this book came in. I start at the events leading up to First Manassas, and I start with some of the things in Alexandria and Ellsworth, which I know there was an exhibit here on Elmer Ellsworth here at the shop not too long ago. Going
There's
to
one at the National Portrait Gallery now in Washington.
yes, I heard that. I'm going out to Washington in a couple of weeks. I can't wait to see it.
It's very good.
How many more books do you envision in this?
Well, this one is Virginia and Maryland, Pennsylvania, through Gettysburg. So this is going to be a volume 1, volume 2, simply because this area is just, it's so packed. So